When someone alternates between hurting you and loving you, your brain does not learn to stop wanting them. It learns to want them more. Take a slow breath. You can let your eyes close if they want to. There is a woman sitting in her car somewhere tonight. The engine is off. The phone is in her hand. The number she deleted 3 times already unblocked. She knows exactly what waits on the other side of that call, and her whole body is pulling toward it anyway. Maybe you have been her. Maybe, right now, you are. What is happening in that car is not a failure of understanding. It is not weakness, or confusion, or love aimed at the wrong person. It is your nervous system running a program it was trained, by fear and repetition and the chemistry of survival, to run. And the training was so complete, so precise, that leaving doesn't feel like freedom. It registers as danger. There is a reason for that. It lives not in weakness, but in the oldest survival wiring in the human brain. And in a moment, I want to show you something discovered almost by accident in studies of infants and their caregivers. A finding that reframes what a trauma bond actually is. Not a failure of judgment, not a flaw in the person who cannot leave. Something older and more precise than either of those. There is also something about a hormone that gets described in every self-help article about this, almost always incorrectly, and what it actually does under conditions of harm changes the question entirely. Not why you stayed, but how you were ever supposed to leave. But to get there, we have to start where most people start, with the wrong explanation. For most of the 20th century, when researchers and clinicians tried to explain why people stayed in abusive relationships, the answer they reached for was psychological in the broadest, least precise sense. It was framed as a failure of self-esteem, a pattern of masochism, a distorted idea of what love was supposed to feel like. The clinical language was often clinical in the worst way. Cold, distancing, subtly accusatory. Why did she stay? Because she had low self-worth. Because she didn't believe she deserved better. Because she had normalized the abnormal. There was truth threaded through these explanations. Low self-worth does play a role. Normalized environments do distort perception. But these explanations carried an implicit assumption that made them, at their core, incomplete. They assumed that the problem was one of perception. That if the person could only see clearly enough, understand completely enough, they would choose to leave and stay gone. They made leaving sound like a problem of insufficient information, a problem of not thinking hard enough. And if you have ever been in that position, if you have thought about it every day for months, read every article, could describe the cycle of abuse in clinical language, and recite its stages like a textbook, those explanations probably felt like an accusation dressed up as an answer, because they missed the most important thing: staying and returning and being unable to stop thinking about someone who has hurt you. These are not primarily cognitive events. They are not failures of reason. They are neurological events, chemical events. The brain, under specific conditions of intermittent reward and chronic stress, undergoes real, measurable, structural changes that make the bond not just emotionally powerful, but physiologically addictive. And to understand how that happens, you have to start with the molecule at the center of it. If you have ever tried to explain the pull to someone who hasn't felt it, tried to describe why leaving felt like loss rather than freedom, why knowing better didn't seem to change what your body wanted, you may have watched their face shift. The researchers who started looking at this closely had the same reaction. What they were hearing didn't sound like a relationship problem. It sounded like addiction. The pattern kept appearing, no matter how many times researchers looked for a different explanation. People who had been harmed, repeatedly, measurably, undeniably, describe the person causing the harm the way people in addiction describe a substance. The highs were intense, the lows were devastating, and leaving produced something that looked, in every clinical detail, like withdrawal. In 1997, working from years of observation with individuals in cycles of abuse and dependency, Dr. Patrick Carnes, a psychologist and researcher specializing in addiction and trauma, gave this pattern a name: trauma bonding. What he was describing was the strong emotional attachment that survivors of abuse often develop toward the very person causing their harm, not as a symptom of confusion, not as a failure of love, as a dependency. Carnes had documented these patterns across hundreds of clinical observations over more than a decade, consistently finding that survivors described not just emotional distress when the relationship ended, but a physical and psychological crash, sometimes lasting weeks, that bore every marker of chemical withdrawal. Carnes was building on decades of foundational work. In the 1960s and 1970s, the British psychiatrist John Bowlby had articulated what would become attachment theory, the idea that human beings are biologically wired, from birth, to form intense emotional bonds with their primary caregivers, and that these bonds are not optional decorations on human experience, but core survival mechanisms. The infant's need to attach is as fundamental as hunger. Proximity to the caregiver is, for the developing brain, synonymous with survival itself. Bowlby understood that this attachment system would be activated most powerfully, not in moments of comfort, but in moments of threat. When frightened, we reach for the person we are attached to. That is the design. What Carnes and the researchers who followed him began to see was that this ancient survival-level system could be hijacked, not broken, not malfunctioning. Hijacked turned toward a person who alternated between tenderness and harm, and trained through repetition and neurochemistry to crave that person with an intensity that had nothing to do with choice. And the mechanism of that hijacking had been sitting in behavioral science laboratories for decades, hiding in plain sight. It had been documented first, not in a study of abusive relationships, but in a study of learning, in a box, with a lever, and a rat that couldn't stop pressing. The mechanism that explains why the brain cannot simply stop craving the person who hurt it had been sitting in a behavioral science laboratory for decades before anyone thought to look for it there. It was documented not in a study of relationships, not in a study of love or attachment or loss, but in a study of pigeons. And what it revealed was not AIT's malfunction. It was the system working exactly as designed. In the 1950s, B.F. Skinner was mapping out what he called schedules of reinforcement, the different rules by which a reward might follow a behavior. Working with pigeons and rats in controlled environments, he tested what happened when the schedule of reward changed. Some schedules delivered a reward every time. Some delivered it on a fixed, predictable interval, and some delivered it variably, after an unpredictable number of responses, with no pattern the animal could learn. What he found changed behavioral science. Of all the reinforcement schedules he tested, the variable ratio schedule, reward delivered after an unpredictable number of attempts, produced behavior that was the most persistent, the most intense, and the most resistant to extinction. It was, as researchers have described it since, the most powerful behavioral trap ever documented. Skinner noted in 1953 that this was precisely the mechanism that made gambling so difficult to stop. The slot machine pays off after an unpredictable number of pulls. You never know if the next one will be the one, so you keep pulling. Here's the part that most people get backwards. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with pleasure and reward, does not spike when the reward arrives. It spikes in anticipation of an uncertain reward. Neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz's research in the 1990s on reward prediction error demonstrated that dopamine neurons fire most intensely, not when we receive something good, but when we are waiting for something good that may or may not come. The uncertainty itself is the dopamine trigger. The not knowing is the chemical event. What this means, in the context of a relationship where affection alternates with coldness is that the brain's dopamine system is not responding to the love. It is responding to the uncertainty about whether the love will arrive. The unpredictability is the chemical event. A relationship where warmth and harm arrive from the same source with no predictable schedule does not register as confusing to the reward system. It registers, based on what the research suggests, as the neurochemical equivalent of a slot machine the brain has been playing for months, trained into a state of desperate, exhausting, biological hope. And there is another piece of this, because dopamine is not working alone. There is a finding about oxytocin that researchers misunderstood for a long time, or rather, that the popular understanding got wrong in a way that matters enormously here. And once you hear it, the question of why the body stays bonded, even after the mind has decided to leave, becomes much harder to dismiss. Oxytocin is often called the bonding hormone or the love hormone. It is released during physical touch, eye contact, nursing, intimacy. It creates feelings of warmth, closeness, and connection. It is part of what bonds a parent to a newborn in the first hours after birth. Research has confirmed its role in building trust, deepening attachment, and reinforcing the neural pathways associated with a particular person. What the popular description leaves out is this: oxytocin is also released during acute stress, during fear, during situations where the body is flooded and overwhelmed and the nervous system is running at maximum. It is part of what researchers have described as the tend and befriend response, a stress response documented by psychologist Shelley Taylor in 2000, in which the threatened organism reaches not only toward fight or flight, but toward closeness and social bonding as a survival strategy. The body, under stress, releases the bonding hormone, and it bonds you to whoever is present. In an abusive relationship, this means that the moments of greatest harm, the confrontations, the frightening unpredictability, the flooding terror, are also the moments when the bonding system is being most powerfully activated. The chemistry does not distinguish between a safe person and an unsafe one. It bonds you to proximity, to presence, to the person in the room when your system is most overwhelmed. And then, when the acute moment passes and the abuser offers warmth, comfort, or reconciliation, the second wave of oxytocin arrives. Relief and bonding, layered on top of fear and bonding. The brain learns the whole sequence: threat, followed by relief, followed by closeness. And over time, it begins to anticipate the closeness from the threat, to crave the sequence the same way it learned to crave any repeated pattern. Meanwhile, the body is running cortisol, the stress hormone, nearly continuously. Research by Inslicht and colleagues, examining neuroendocrine activity in female survivors of intimate partner violence, found that cortisol levels in women who had developed trauma-related symptoms remained significantly elevated throughout the day, even long after leaving the acute situation, indicating lasting changes in the functioning of the HPA axis, the brain-body stress system. The body becomes calibrated to this level of activation. The dysregulated state starts to feel normal, and paradoxically, the presence of the person associated with the threat begins to feel like the fastest path back to regulation, because the brain has learned that reconciliation follows harm. Relief is coming. The body is waiting for it. None of this is metaphor. These are measurable chemical events, occurring in real tissue, producing real behavioral compulsion. The person who cannot leave is not weak. They are running a survival program that has been reinforced, chemically, thousands of times. And there is still the deepest layer, the one I have been saving, the finding that changes the meaning of everything else. The alarm fires and the hand reaches out. That is the behavior the researchers kept observing, not in adults trying to leave abusive relationships, but in infants, in very young children who had been frightened repeatedly by the same person who was also their primary source of comfort and survival. What those children did every single time told the researchers something that changed the way the field understood the word bond. In 1990, developmental psychologists Mary Main and Judith Solomon formally described a fourth pattern of infant attachment, one they called disorganized or disoriented. Working with data from hundreds of infant caregiver pairs in the strange situation procedure, they identified a group of infants whose behavior during reunions with their caregivers defied every existing category. They didn't lean in, as secure infants did. They didn't strategically avoid, as avoidant infants did. They didn't protest with controlled intensity, as anxious infants did. They froze. They moved toward the caregiver, while simultaneously pulling back. They reached out and then stilled, as if caught between two equally powerful and opposite commands. Main described these infants as experiencing what she called fright without solution. The caregiver, who is supposed to be the safe haven, the destination when the alarm goes off, had also become the source of the alarm. The infant was frightened, and the person their brain told them to run to was the person they were frightened of. The attachment system fired its command: seek proximity. The threat detection system fired its command: stay away. And caught between two imperative survival signals, the only response the infant could produce was collapse, a behavioral breakdown where neither strategy was possible. A 1999 meta-analysis by von Isendorn, Schwingel, and Bakermans-Cranenberg, examining data across dozens of studies, found that 48% of infants classified as disorganized in attachment assessments had been assessed by social services as having experienced abuse or neglect. Nearly half. And yet, every single one of them medias. Those infants still turn toward their caregiver in moments of distress. Every time. Not because they had forgotten the harm, not because they were unable to perceive the danger, but because the brain, in its most primitive layers, does not offer a third option. You seek the attachment figure. That is the command. The system does not have a subroutine for seek a different person. Not at that age. Not with that wiring. Take a breath. Let that sit for a moment. Because here's what this means for you. If you cannot leave, or keep leaving and coming back, or have ever sat in a car past midnight with the number already unblocked, the pull toward the person who has harmed you is not confusion. It is not love aimed at the wrong target. It is the disorganized attachment pattern, fright without solution, encoded not just psychologically, but neurologically, sometimes from the earliest experiences of life, and activated in full with a precision that bypasses the rational mind entirely. The attachment system does not malfunction in a trauma bond. It functions exactly. It has simply fused the threat and the safe haven into one person. And when that person is absent, the alarm fires. And it points directly at the source of the danger, because that is where the brain has learned the relief is stored. Which means that everything we have just covered, the dopamine loop, the oxytocin cascade, the cortisol habituation, all of it looks completely different now. It is not a series of separate failures. It is one integrated, ancient, elegant, and devastating survival system running at full capacity. Aimed at the wrong target by training it did not choose, not damage, architecture. One of the most disorienting things about trying to leave, if you have tried or are trying now, is how wrong it feels. Not difficult, wrong. Like walking in the opposite direction from a gravitational pull. Like trying to unknow something your body has been rehearsing for months or years. The withdrawal symptoms that follow are real. They are not metaphorical. Research and clinical documentation describe a consistent cluster. intense anxiety that arrives in waves with no clear trigger, a persistent sense of emptiness or loss that doesn't respond to reassurance, intrusive thoughts about the other person that arrive without invitation. Physical symptoms, including nausea, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, a generalized physical ache, obsessive checking of their social media, of mutual contacts, of the spaces they might occupy, and an overwhelming, irrational urge to return. If you have ever felt ashamed of any of those things, if you have ever deleted the number and then unblocked it, or driven past their street at 11 p.m., telling yourself you just needed to know they were home, this is why. Not a failure of resolve. Not a deficit of self-respect. Not weakness. Chemistry. The neurological parallel to substance addiction is not a rough analogy. Based on what the research suggests, it is structural. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway, the same circuit at the center of addiction to cocaine, alcohol, and opioids, appears to be the circuit trained by the abuse cycle. When chronic intermittent reward conditions this pathway, it produces receptor changes, tolerance effects, and a craving state that feels, physically, like the cravings of substance dependence. Researchers have inferred from addiction models that, over time, the system may begin to require more stimulation to produce the same relief, which could explain why, in many trauma-bonded relationships, the intensity of the cycle tends to escalate rather than stabilize. Not because of a choice, because of what the chemistry is asking for. And the amygdala, the brain's threat detection and fear response center, has, by the time someone is considering leaving, been shaped by months or years of chronic activation. Brain imaging research, including work reviewed by Bremner and colleagues published in the journal Dialogues in Clinical Neuroscience, shows that chronic traumatic stress is associated with measurable changes in amygdala responsivity, reduced volume in the prefrontal cortex regions responsible for regulation and rational assessment, and decreased hippocampal function, which means the ability to contextualize past harm, to hold the knowledge of what happened against the current feeling of craving, is itself neurologically compromised. You cannot simply think your way out of a trauma bond, because the parts of the brain most responsible for thinking clearly are the parts most depleted by what created the bond. There is a detail about what recovery is supposed to feel like, something most people in this position are never told, and it changes everything about what it means to start. For most of the 20th century, the clinical explanation for staying was personal failure, low self-esteem, learned helplessness, a distorted idea of love. Those explanations placed the weight of the harm on the person who was harmed. They made leaving sound like a problem of not wanting it enough. That framing caused immeasurable damage to people who were, in fact, running a survival program no one had thought to name. The capacity for intense attachment, even misdirected attachment, is not a flaw in the human system. It is among its most fundamental adaptive functions. The infant who turns toward a frightening caregiver is not making a mistake. They are executing the only survival strategy available: maintain proximity to the attachment figure, because proximity is the precondition for everything else. The adult who keeps returning, who cannot unfeel the pull, who experiences leaving as a kind of biological emergency. They are not broken. They are demonstrating the extraordinary depth and persistence of the attachment system at work. Take a moment with that, because it changes what the experience of staying actually was. It was not evidence of damage. It was evidence of a capacity so powerful that even when it was aimed at the wrong person, it held. The system is strong. That strength, aimed over time toward a safe and consistent person, is the basis of secure adult attachment, the kind of bond associated with better physical health outcomes, greater emotional resilience, and deeper satisfaction in relationships. That capacity for fierce, cellular-level bonding is not the problem. What was done with it is the problem. And this distinction matters, not just philosophically, but practically. because it means that recovery is not about building something from scratch. It is about redirecting something that already exists, about teaching a system that already knows how to bond with overwhelming intensity to begin, slowly and carefully, to aim it somewhere it will be safe. The question is not whether that capacity can be redirected. The question is what it might feel like, for the first time, to aim it somewhere that will hold. Here is what most survivors are not told. Recovery from a trauma bond does not feel, in the early weeks, like getting better. It feels like withdrawal, because it is withdrawal. The anxiety, the craving, the intrusive thoughts, the physical ache, the desperate pull back toward the person. These are not signs that you made the wrong decision, or that the relationship was actually what you needed, or that leaving was a mistake. They are signs that the dopamine system has been deconditioned from its primary source of stimulation and is in the early phase of rebuilding its baseline. These symptoms are temporary. They are predictable, and they are evidence not of weakness, but of the depth of what was formed and the reality of what is being dismantled. Research on dopamine receptor recovery in context of addiction and chronic stress suggests meaningful neurological change is possible within weeks of consistent low stimulation baseline, which is why no contact recommendations in trauma bonding recovery are often framed as protective, not just emotionally, but neurologically. Each period without contact allows the reward pathway to begin recalibrating, to reduce its association between this particular person and the dopamine signal, and to lower the fever pitch activation that keeps the craving state running. It is slow. It is not linear. There will be days that feel like regression and are not. If you are the person who sat in that car, or who has been that person, this is what is possible for you. Not just intellectually understanding what happened to your brain, but changing what your body does with it. There is also emerging evidence for more targeted neurological approaches. Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, known as EMDR, developed by Francine Shapiro in the late 1980s and extensively validated in subsequent decades for trauma. Treatment has shown particular promise in the context of trauma bonding. The mechanism involves bilateral sensory stimulation, alternating left and right auditory or tactile input, which is thought to engage processes similar to REM sleep, the brain's natural memory consolidation and emotional processing phase. In the context of trauma bonding, EMDR appears to work by weakening the link between specific memories and the acute stress response, not erasing the memories, but moving them from the state-dependent emotional system, where they keep triggering craving and terror in the present, into a more integrated, accessible narrative form where they can be understood without being relived. Somatic approaches, therapy that works with the body's stored stress rather than the cognitive narrative alone, are also gaining significant evidence support. The work of Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing in the 1970s and 1980s, and the clinical framework articulated by Bessel van der Kolk in decades of subsequent research and practice, both point toward the same core finding. Trauma lives in the body, not only in thought. The trembling, the physical craving, the chest tightness, the sensory pull. These are body-held states, and they respond to body-level intervention in ways that talking alone sometimes cannot reach. Regulating the nervous system through somatic awareness, breathwork, gentle movement, and titrated exposure to bodily sensation gives the survival system a new experience. That the body can be activated without catastrophe following. That the alarm can fire and not mean what it has always meant. Supportive relationships play a measurable role. Research on trauma recovery consistently identifies the presence of at least one safe, consistent, believing relationship as among the most powerful, protective, and healing factors. Not a relationship that fixes anything, simply one that demonstrates, repeatedly and reliably, that Closeness does not have to mean harm. That warmth does not have to be followed by coldness. That the attachment system can begin to learn what predictable safety feels like, one small experience at a time. The very thing that makes you feel most broken, the fact that you couldn't simply decide to stop feeling it, couldn't logic your way out, couldn't stop yourself from deleting the number and unblocking it again, is actually evidence of how completely the system worked. It was trained. It ran its program. And a system that can be trained, that completely can, with time and support and a new set of experiences, be retrained. Not back to a blank state. Forward, into something it has never been before. Not damage, potential. You are still in that car. It is still past 2 a.m. The street is still quiet. The phone is still in your hand. The number is still there, unblocked, waiting. You are not confused about love. You are someone whose brain is working exactly the way a brain works after it has been through what yours has been through. And you don't make the call. Not because you have stopped feeling it. You still feel it. The pull, the ache, the biological hunger. But you put the phone face down on the seat, and you take one breath. Just one. And in that single moment, in that small space between the impulse and the action, something new is beginning. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but the way most real things begin. Quietly, in the dark, with one decision that feels impossibly hard and is still somehow made. Recovery from a trauma bond is not a story that begins when the feeling stops. It begins when you can hold the feeling and not act on it. When you can know what the craving is made of and choose, just this once, not to feed it. And then again, just this once, the next time, and the time after that. You are not what was done to your nervous system. You are the person sitting in the car who didn't make the call, who chose, against the full weight of biology, one quiet breath over the phone. That is not a small thing. That is the beginning of everything. If this felt like something worth returning to, it would mean a great deal if you liked it and subscribed to the channel. It helps more people find their way here, to this quiet space, at whatever hour they need it most. Now, let the car, and the phone, and the quiet street fade. Let your breathing be easy. Let your body feel heavy and warm and still. You have heard what you needed to hear, and you can rest now. Good night.